Libo. Before we get started, a content warning. This episode contains descriptions of sexual and emotional abuse. Would you call his actions towards you a felony?
Yep, I would.
Can you explain why?
Because oral sex is still sex, and it is statutory rape, and I looked up ages of consent both in Russia and Israel, and what we were doing was far below that.
From Libo, you're listening to The Adults in the Room. My name is Nastya Krasilnikova. This is episode 2, Something Indecent. In 2008, Mark Gondelman was a 22-year-old student at Hebrew University in Jerusalem studying Jewish thought. One evening, at a dinner party at his friend's house, he met Sara Bezrukavnikova.
I was, I think, maybe 11 or early 12. It was in Jerusalem, Israel, in my family, friends, and his acquaintances' house. I think it was maybe a dinner party, and I came there with my parents, or maybe just my dad, and he was there.
This is Sara. She is 27 now. She lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and she is a research assistant at Harvard University. Before moving to the US in 2013, she and her family lived in Moscow, where she attended School 57. Sara and her parents would come to Israel from Moscow once or twice a year to visit friends and relatives. So back to the dinner party in 2008.
I didn't super understand what the conversation was about, but I remember it had to do with spiritual philosophy and literature. I remember, that child feeling when adults around you are having, a big adult conversation and you're just there, just kind of being in awe of things you don't understand because you don't understand them. That's kind of how I felt.
I asked Sara what her impression of Mark was when she met him.
I thought that he was eloquent and confident. He had sort of mid-length hair. He was kind of curiously dressed. I thought he was good-looking. He sort of reminded me of illustrations in children medieval fairy tales, almost knight-like. I think because of the hair. One of us sent the other one an email, just sort of acknowledging that it was, pleasure to make an acquaintance. I think actually maybe he reached out to me first, and he said that I made a good impression, and I honestly don't remember saying much that evening, and I would be surprised if I did because, as I said, I didn't super understand a lot of it. And then we started an on and off email correspondence.
Sara and her family returned to Israel some months later when she was 12 years old. Mark invited her to grab a coffee on Hebrew University's campus at Mount Scopus.
I remember just feeling very tense because I felt like this was an intellectual challenge for me because I had to support a conversation with this, much older, much smarter guy. And I just remember sort of being very much alert the whole time we were sitting there and drinking coffee because I really wanted to say the right thing and I really wanted to impress him. And I just remember walking away and feeling relieved that it was over. It almost felt like an academic interview.
Mark and Sara started exchanging emails. Sara shared with me some of the emails from Mark. They were written in Russian and we translated them to English and asked our producer Sam to voice a passage from one of them. This email was sent in 2009. Mark writes to Sara.
Ever since we started talking, the question of age has been on my mind. It may be a bit awkward to bring up, but this difference, me being 23 and you only 12, really intrigues me. I'm not saying I have any particular thoughts about this, but what I feel is that such a difference, and at our age it is indeed significant, poses a certain question or challenge. I can't express it more precisely. I don't remember myself very well at 12, but 12 is a completely different time for a boy. I remember that I was still playing children's games with my brother. Our universe, though already fading, was not yet forgotten. I didn't think about literature or philosophy or anything like that. I recall that was the time I stopped being an outsider in class and started experiencing some degree of socialization. I lived in what was a charmed but still essentially childish world, and if you had met me as I was then, we would have had nothing to talk about. We would have been as though from different geological eras. It's amazing to me that we somehow find common ground, but every once in a while I wonder, is it really so? Is understanding possible? On the other hand, who am I to question it? Many of my friends and teachers are in their 30s and 40s, and I have spirited and meaningful relationships with them. The age difference I have with them is even greater than with you, and yet is no hindrance at all.
At some point, he invited me to his place, and he invited me to lie down with him. I still remember feeling very, very tense, and I was very uncomfortable, and I knew that something wrong was happening. He asked me first if I've ever done this with anyone before, and, I was 12, so I didn't have a lot of experience lying with other people. And I think, again, I was just in this mindset of it all being some sort of test or something. So I was like, yeah, of course. I've done this backwards and forwards and 100 times. And he was like, okay, interesting. I also think that it was flattering that he invited me at the time. So it didn't feel so wrong that he didn't do anything that would have felt completely out of any bounds, but he sort of pushed a line, and I thought that because it felt really challenging, I should go along with it. I should play along. I should pretend that this is what I like and this is what I want. I felt guilty because it felt out of normalcy. I couldn't categorize the situation. I didn't really know what happened, why it happened. It felt unusual, and I didn't really have the vocabulary to talk to anyone about that right after it happened first. I think one of the next times we hung out, he kissed me, and I think after that, I sort of forced myself to feel more admiration for him. I think I still felt intimidated, and then once he sort of kept pushing that line that didn't feel right, but also didn't feel too wrong. But once he started making these steps, I forced myself to internally grow that awe-inspiring, trepidation, actually, I think is a good word. That trepidation that I felt for him, I think I nurtured it into a romantic image. I sort of pushed myself to be in love with him a little bit because I thought that that is what should be done.
Sara lived in Moscow and Mark lived in Jerusalem. They would visit each other, but mostly their relationship was long distance.
We exchanged a lot of emails. The first email that he sent me when he decided that he wants me to be his girlfriend or whatever the fuck. It was titled The Questions of Optics. Again, at the time, I had no fucking clue what that can even mean. Of course, now I understand that what he meant is, how will people see us? And I was like, I don't remember what I responded, but I think after that, he took bolder steps. He started touching me more whenever we saw each other, and I never quite got rid of that tense feeling where I didn't know what to do. I was caught off guard permanently. At some point, I think it must have been in Israel, where he forced me to have oral sex with him. It didn't feel like forcing at the time. It didn't feel like anything. I was just so confused and so tense. That is really what I remember the most, is just feeling constantly very, very tense. And he just kept pushing that line. I think he said, "You're good at it," and I wanted to be good at it. I wanted to like seem more adult, and I wanted to keep doing what adults do. But that's how it started. It started with him introducing oral sex into the relationship.
And did you know much about sex at that age?
Yes, he told me about all of his previous experiences. He had a long-term girlfriend who was his age, and he told me in like vivid detail about their sexual encounters and sort of fostered that comparison in my head between like, if I want the great honor of being his girlfriend, I should really like perform as his girlfriend, and that's what his girlfriends do. He had a great habit of taking naked pictures of women that he had slept with. I was one of them. He told me to pose naked for him at his apartment, and I think at a conference we went to together, and I don't think he ever sent me those pictures, so I'm sure he still has them somewhere. But he had this almost collectionist approach to them. You know, these are the women that I've been with, and it was almost like a museum of his past conquests.
I asked Sara, was there anything about being around Mark that she actually enjoyed?
You know, we read like Plato's dialogues together, and he'd explain things to me, and that part I actually enjoyed. And as far as fun goes, he'd bring me to different like conferences and parties, and people there were kind of cool sometimes. Again, it was all part of me, I think, wanting to be more grown up. I was drinking with these people who I've heard like legends about.
All those people that surrounded you there, were they okay with a grown-up guy with an underage girl on his hand?
That's something that I cannot figure out myself. No one talked to me. People still fawned over him, and people still invited him places, and he'd bring me. Nobody ever was like trying to reach out and trying to check in. But they also weren't trying to get very close to me because I think they were kind of revolted by the situation, as they should have been. So they were kind of like avoiding looking at me directly, like something indecent was happening, which it was. But then, yeah, nobody really raised the concern, which was just crazy.
The parties were attended by people associated with the Sambation Summer School, where Mark worked, as well as some teachers from School 57.
He got a lot of intellectual validation from the awe that I think I showed him and the questions that I was asking. He talked a lot about teachers and students and how, you know, the knowledge is transferred from one person to another, and he framed our relationship in terms of that as well, like he was my teacher.
Mark would push Sara to write essays about philosophy books he gave her. In one of his emails to her, he writes, "How do you understand the word soul? Please give me a definition." And what was your relative's reaction on your relationship with this man?
They weren't happy. Mentally, I was in a space where I blamed myself for everything that seemed off-putting and not okay about that relationship. And I just thought that I'd disappoint them, to be honest, if I told them the whole truth. So I never did. My grandmother, who looked out for me and was really concerned for me, found email chain that was pretty sexual. I think I was 13 at the time. She was so angry and sad, and that really sort of made me feel even more guilty. And I just shut in, like, within myself even more. My dad apparently went to a psychologist, and my dad lived in the US since I was 6, and he went to a consultation here. And basically what he heard is, you know, if this was America, you would have just gotten a restraining order. But unfortunately, it wasn't America, and they just didn't know what they could do. And I think they felt like, you know, every step in either direction would exacerbate the situation. It would make me feel worse. And Mark, I think a lot of, actually in my experience, and from what I've heard and read, a lot of people who prey on kids and on younger people, they use this strategy where they frame it as like a human rights issue that, your society considers you young and immature, but I see how great you are. I see how smart you are. You deserve to do all the things that everyone else does. You deserve to be treated as an adult. So he would use that discourse and make me believe that my family were suppressing my rights as a human being. He knew that my weak point is guilt, that I'm very prone to guilt-tripping myself, and he would paint this picture of him being like a suffering artist and a tortured soul. And then when I would distance myself and when I would show inclinations to leave, which I think I started showing pretty quickly, because as I said, I was not having a good time. I didn't want to be there. I was tense. I was nervous. I think I told him that I want out of it, and he made me feel like I'm hurting him, and he's already hurting so much. He actually proposed to me when I was 13. He made me promise me that I'd never leave and that I'll support him forever, which is fucking crazy. How do you say that to a child, But yeah, that was his main manipulation tool, is just guilt.
And he proposed you when you were 13, but he knew that you can't marry him because you're too small. So what was the idea?
Well, first of all, he said that, according to Torah, the fucking Old Testament, I can actually, because girls become of age at 12 in Judaism. But I think he wanted to marry me as soon as I turned 18.
Mark gave her a silver ring with garnet gemstones. Sara liked the ring and even wore it for a while. But when she turned 14, she decided to end the relationship.
At that point, just a person who just complains to me and guilt trips me and forces me to write him essays as a declaration of love, it no longer felt like something I could even entertain. So at some point I just said goodbye and stopped responding to his letters. And then he called me a bitch. He said that I became a bitch and that he's so disappointed and he can't believe that, he called me evil. He also wrote poetry, and he wrote something about my evil curly head or something, because I have curly hair. And then I was just I do not care. I truly can't make myself care anymore about this.
This is from an email Mark sent to Sara in July of 2011.
You are a wicked little girl who does not understand what it's like to wake up the morning after and know that up until lunch, the one in your heart, whom you wholeheartedly loved and fucked and experienced, to her, you were a miserable piece of shit.
Mark writes in plain words that he fucked Sara. And yes, we have confirmed that the address that sent these emails belongs to Mark. Did he have any concerns about your age difference at the time you were together?
He never addressed it directly. I think a lot of child molesters sort of convinced their victims of that I was special and that I was his equal. I just had my doubts, but I never really vocalized them because I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable saying anything. But then one of our last conversations that I really, really vividly remember, he said that, there are many truths, Sara. There's a truth that I'm an asshole and you're just a little girl, but we don't need that truth. We're going to get rid of it. And I was like, you can't really get rid of truth though, can you? And that also was something that really made me, I think, become internally okay with cutting him off. When I turned 22, I remember thinking that this is the age that Mark was having sex with an 11-year-old. Well, okay, maybe we didn't have sex when I was 11, but I think we started when I was 12. Not much better. The fact that it was okay in ancient fucking Judea doesn't make it okay in the 21st century. It's disgusting. It's disgusting to think about to allow your mind to even turn in that direction it is unfathomable to me. And the only reason why I was okay with that back then is because I saw myself as an adult and I wanted to be more adult. You know, I cannot imagine what must be going through your head if you're I'm in my mid-20s, like, how is that on your mind? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing with your life? What are you doing with yourself? How are you not more ashamed? What is wrong with you? Like, imagining it as a situation is disgusting, let alone acting on it.
A year after Sara broke up with Mark, Revekka Gershovich arrived at Sambation, the summer camp for talented Jewish children. It was the summer of 2012. As you'll recall from our first episode, Revekka was 14 years old and considering whether to switch to School 57 in Moscow. Mark was now a 26-year-old teacher at Sambation who had a habit of comparing himself to Jesus.
He was a teacher. At that point, he was doing his master's in the Jerusalem University in Jewish thought and in philosophy. And he would read lectures about that.
One of the places the Sambation class visited that summer was the Ukrainian city of Lviv. One evening, Revekka wanted to have a walk around the city. She was too young to go alone, so one of the teachers, Mark Gondelman, agreed to accompany her.
And during that walk, he started reading me poetry and telling me things that were very romantic and very smart and made me feel very unusual, very,
Special.
Special, yes, special. And we walked the whole night around Lviv, and it was very, very beautiful there. And we sat at some point, and he was holding my hand, and I completely was enamored with him. And it completely, tallied with all my knowledge of Russian literature and poetry and everything. I felt very romantic. I felt extreme emotions. It's not that I was surprised that he was into it. It was that all of it was directed at me, that the poems were love poems and were cited at me and kind of about me and him and stuff. And that the walking outside we were doing together, holding hands, and it was so romantic. I was completely in love. It was my first love. I never felt anything like that before. He was like opening new worlds to me, opening new horizons and everything.
But did you think at the point that there was something odd about him being an adult man, falling in romantic love with a 14-year-old girl?
I did not think any such thing. I thought that was normal. I mean, because all of my ideas about relationships were coming from Russian books. And, Turgenev, pretty normal to have a young girl and an older male. Tolstoy, same thing. I did not hear anything about how it was inappropriate for older men to be in love with a younger girl. And then the day after that, we were walking and he was talking about, with me again. And I remember in that very time, he started telling me about his love story with Sara, who later turned out to be Sara Bezrukavnikova.
Sara and Revekka met that autumn at School 57, where Revekka eventually enrolled. They became friends. When Revekka told Sara about her closeness with Mark, Sara gave her a warning.
I told her he's a bastard and Mark is fucking terrible. I was pushed so much that I never wanted to push others in the same way, but I try to communicate the fact that I think it's pretty black and white. Mark is a piece of shit and he should just be avoided as such. There's nothing good that can come out of that.
Sara was definitely telling me about her relationship with Mark, but that was when we were already close and when I was way further along in that relationship. And namely, she really was trying to get me out of that relationship. She was saying that it was very traumatic and abusive and that Mark is an asshole and that it's not good for me. And she was offering all sorts of help to get me out of it. And I still really appreciate that.
I think Revekka and I were kind of feeling a similar sort of teenage rebelliousness. And again, like a Russian expression, like "на море по колено," and like translating as the sea is like up to our knees, that we're bigger than any obstacle, that we're bigger than anything. And I don't know if I've ever actually put this into words, but I had a thought that it is, again, guilt, right? Like that it is my fault that he's doing it to her because I allowed him to do it to me. And yeah, it's not my fault. It's his fault.
He lived in Jerusalem, namely on Haham Shalom Street. I remember that very well because I went to visit him there. And then later he visited Moscow several times. So he would come to Moscow pretty often. And on top of that, I also went to Israel myself. And it was very official that we were together. We talked about it. We talked about infidelity and loyalty and everything in that relationship. And mainly it applied to me and not to him. The first time that he touched me in a way that was definitely sexual, I think I was 14. I might have been 15, but most likely I was 14. When he did more than just touch me through like clothes in a way that's definitely sexual, like when he grinded on me and grinded on my stomach with his penis, that was when I was 15 already.
Did you have any conversation about this part of your relationship?
Yeah, so I really didn't want that. And I've been very vocal and adamant about it. I wasn't so vocal and adamant about the touching part. I just was very confused about it and didn't really know what it was. And nobody kind of talked about it. It was just like, okay, he's touching me. I guess that's normal. He was touching me on the hand and now he's touching me on the boob. Not something we really talked about and not something I really thought about. It was smooth transition that I did not understand what was happening, and I was like, I remember very well being like confused by, for instance, feeling his penis through his underwear and my clothes and being like, I'm not sure what that is. It's an interesting thing, feels weird. I don't know what the fuck it is. And later on, when he wanted to grind on me, that's when we started having conversations about sex. I remember that he was talking about how he really wants to have sex with me. He also was talking about how he really wants to take my virginity. And I was very, very opposed to it. So it happened when I was in Israel and I was visiting him and I was staying with him. And he kept telling me that if you are staying at somebody's house, you cannot deny them sex. And I was like, I really don't want to have sex with you. Please, let's not have sex with you. Let's not have sex. I don't want to do this. And he kept pressing me and pressing me and pressing me. At some point, he brought me to the Jerusalem Bazaar. And there is a place there called Basta Basta. He invited his friend Orly there. She also graduated from the same school I graduated from, 57th school. He told her that, well, I, meaning like Rivka, refuses to have sex with me. Tell, like, kind of, here is our relationship problem. And she was like, well, why are you refusing? What is going on? And I started explaining to her that, like, I don't want to. And she was like, well, you stay at a man's house and you live at his place and you expect not to have sex with him? That's wrong. If you live at somebody's house, you are supposed to have sex with them. And I was like, well, I guess that's so then. And I'm just wrong about it. And I should just let him do what he wants.
I've talked to Mark's friend, Orly. She didn't want to be interviewed on tape, but she confirmed that she met with Mark and Revekka in the Basta Basta restaurant in Jerusalem. Inna doesn't remember this subject being discussed, and she denies that she ever told Revekka that she had to have sex with Mark.
I think like the same one night we came back and he started grinding on my stomach and coming from that, and I was like absolutely disgusted, and it was the first time that I was like looking at the ceiling and completely disassociating from what was going on around me. I just didn't want to think about it. I just didn't want to perceive it, percept it. I wanted to turn off my consciousness at that point. So I was looking at the ceiling and thinking that we had plans to go to synagogue later in the day. I think it was Friday. Or maybe the conversation happened Thursday and we were having sex Friday. At any rate, I was looking at the ceiling and thinking, oh, it's so beautiful. The singing in the synagogue is so beautiful. And there is the ceiling, and there is a little dot on the ceiling. I still remember how his ceiling looks. It's kind of funny, like that's the part I remember the best about his apartment, because I looked at it so much and stared at it so hard. Started grinding on me, and he came on me, and then he didn't want me to remove his cum from my stomach, but at the end of the day I did, or maybe he allowed me to. This is really fuzzy, but yeah, that's how it was.
Did you tell him how uncomfortable you were during these interactions?
I think it was pretty damn obvious, and I think it was pretty damn obvious that I didn't want to do it again, but he made me do it again. I don't think I said it explicitly to him, but I think he very well knew that. He was very well aware of it.
Mark considered himself an observant Jew. In one of our interviews, Revekka described him as the most Jewish of the Jews. He didn't use electricity on Shabbat and would eat only kosher food.
So he was a vegetarian, and he was observing kosher rules, and I was neither. I did not observe kosher rules, and I was not vegetarian. And at some point, he came to my apartment and forced me to make some of the dishes kosher. And then he threw out of my fridge every single thing that was non-kosher, and I was so angry about it. Or every single thing that was non-kosher and non-vegetarian, which was almost all of them. It was ridiculous. My parents left me stuff and he just threw them out.
Mark also involved Revekka in his intellectual life, and that felt controlling. I've seen this in dozens of emails from Mark that Revekka shared with me. A grown man bewildering a young girl and scolding her for failing to keep up.
He would force me to write letters to him, and then he would criticize them to me. He would tell me that I write worse than Sara did, or that I was, generally poorly, or that I don't understand him. He would also talk to me in a very, very complicated language.
Your words scream of the fact that you are 15 and exude what is called eros. Oh, if flesh were as kind, transparent, and reckless as your text can be. If it soared in the wind as the Russian language does. But wise flesh is heavy like a leaden disc. And so, in order to survive, people invent not only Galatian youths, but also morals, to somehow cope with that master we call the body.
And for instance, I couldn't distinguish between the sexual terms that he used and the philosophical terms that he used because I didn't know either. And so at some point, my mom and I were watching another amazing pedophile Woody Allen's movie. And in that movie, the main character hangs himself and says, "Oh, I wish I could get a blowjob from my wife," after he hangs himself. And in Russian, it's a French word, minette, and that, is not used in any other context than that. And I had no idea what it meant, but I knew that Mark kept talking to me about minette, blowjob, 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 and I had no idea what it was. And I thought it was a philosophical term, and I must ask my mom, "Mom, tell me, is that a philosophical term?" And my mom was like, "What?"
How did your relationship end?
I kicked him out of my apartment. I think it was actually after he threw out all my non-kosher stuff. I was so angry at him that I just said that I don't want him in my apartment again.
As Sara put it in one of our conversations, both she and Revekka are doing pretty well now. They both live in Boston, they have impressive careers in academia, and they've built healthy relationships. But Sara's and Revekka's journeys to this point were long and difficult. They've done a lot of work to understand how this all happened. I've spent months trying to understand it too. Mark's never really spoken to me, but through hours of conversations with people who knew him, and by poring over his writing, I feel like I've gotten inside his head. There's one thing about him I can't wrap my brain around, though. In his emails, Mark is shockingly straightforward about the nature of his relationships with these girls. The references to how he fucked and loved Sara with all his heart, or to sex with Revekka. He's put evidence of criminal activity in writing to his alleged victims. How could he be so careless? I've come to a few possible explanations. One is that he's sincere in his inappropriate expressions of love to these girls, and sincere in his belief that his Jewish faith justifies sexual relationships with children. Or maybe he just felt confident that Sara and Revekka would never speak out about their experiences, and that even if they did, it wouldn't matter. Sara remembers Mark bringing her to parties of the Sambation and School 57 communities where no one checked in to see whether she was okay. Where were the grown-ups in all this? Why didn't they see what was happening and stop it? That's on the next episode. The Adults in the Room is produced by Libo Studio. All episodes are out now, so you can play the next one right away. This podcast has a website where you can find additional visual materials collected throughout our investigation and contact information for feedback. The link is in the description box. This show is hosted, reported, and written by me, Nastya Krasilnikova. A huge thank you to my colleagues, researcher and fact-checker Vika Labanova, producers and editors Nastya Medvedeva, Sam Colbert, and Dasha Cherkudinova, composer and sound designer Ildar Fatahov, and the head of Libo, Lika Kremer. Legal support is provided by Michael Svard and Alon Sapir from Michael Svard Law Office, and Sergei Markov, managing partner of the law firm Markov and Madaminov. Thank you for listening.